Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. It's been running since 2001 and to some people it's become some sort of an annual pilgrimage. I'm talking of FOSDEM, the Free and Open Source Software Developers European Meeting, which is what it stands for, that happens every year over the first weekend in February on the campus of the Free University of Brussels in Belgium. On their website, you can see that it has well over 1,000 talks and, over the course of the weekend, thousands of visitors. In addition to talks and keynotes, you get to meet open source organizations, companies, and activists who have stands all around the campus. Unlike other conferences, there is no registration and no registration fee to pay. With FOSDEM, all you do is simply show up. Having said that, getting into a room and getting a seat can actually be quite a challenge, but that's for another day. It's not the first time I've been to FOSDEM. Some of you might remember that I did an episode on FOSDEM in 2023, and in fact this episode 2 years ago was the very first time I covered a conference in this podcast at all. And looking back, or rather listening to it again, I'm not quite sure that I haven't made a dog's dinner out of it. Well, as with so many things in life, you learn by doing. Also, with FOSDEM, I confess I picked a rather tricky event to cover, certainly for a first attempt. To begin with, and as I said before, FOSDEM is massive. And secondly, I think of FOSDEM not so much as one big, single conference, but as a collection of mini-conferences. These mini-conferences are called developer rooms, or dev rooms in short. And when I say mini, don't take that literally, because some of them have quite a large turnout. At any rate, dev rooms are where the action is, and there's a large number to choose from. I counted over 70. Not surprisingly, they cover a wide range of different topics. In alphabetical order, they run from ADA, the programming language, to web performance. Interested in railways and public transport? Well, there's a dev room for that, as there is for energy and a session on legislative issues in Europe. Of course, you also get more hardcore computing dev rooms, such as the one on kernels or one on high-performance computing. Some of the dev rooms run for half a day, others for an entire day. There are very popular ones, and others may be a little bit more fringe. Some dev rooms, like the one on high-performance computing, have been running for many years, and they seem to have a bunch of loyal followers. The reason that I went to FOSDEM this year was a dev room of a special kind, at least I think so. I'm talking about the dev room on open research, open science. That FOSDEM, a conference on free and open source software after all, is hosting a dev room on open science is not really surprising given the fact that most research these days requires some form of software or another. And at least some of it is available as open source, but not all. And so promoting the use of open source software in research is important. Important, that is, if you believe in open science at all, of which open source software is an integral part. This is not the first time that open research makes an appearance at FOSDEM and has a dedicated dev room, and in fact, the dev room was added to FOSDEM in 2020, 5 years ago. I actually know some of the organizers of the dev room, Sarah Petty, for instance, from the Open Knowledge Foundation, and Diego Antolinos Basso, who at the time worked at Sciences Po in Paris, France. In the run-up to FOSDEM 25, we talked about covering the Open Research dev room in a podcast episode. The idea took a more concrete shape during a prep meeting in January that the dev room organizers kindly invited me to, and so on a cold February day, I found myself standing in front of room 126 in one of the buildings of the Free University of Brussels, ready for a day on open source software in research. It turned out to be a full-on busy and pretty crowded day with end-to-end presentations running non-stop between 10:30 in the morning and 7 o'clock in the evening, at which time the janitors were getting a little bit impatient and tried to rush us out. In other words, a typical FOSDEM session. So what happened on that day? What were the subjects discussed in this nearly 9-hour-long session? There were in total over 20 presentations, back to back, no breaks, and when you leave the room, you may not get back in, as free spaces are usually taken up quickly. Did I say that FOSDEM can be a little bit hardcore? Well, anyway, the day's proceedings kicked off with a presentation from Peter Murray-Rust about semantic climate, a project to create a knowledge graph from the vast volume of documents covering climate change, with the aim to enhance our awareness and knowledge about climate change and the hope that ultimately it will lead to some actions. Peter and I found a few minutes in the rather noisy corridor afterwards just outside the deaf room.
So I'm Peter Murray-Rust from Cambridge, England, and I've co-founded a project, Semantic Climate, with Geeta Yadav in New Delhi in India. It's a very international project. We do much of it online, and we have about 50 people in our community.
So how did you get involved in this project?
Geeta and I have worked on plant science, plant chemistry for many years.
Are you a biologist?
I'm a chemist.
Oh, you're a chemist.
I'm
okay.
a chemist, yes. We worked on plant chemistry, making it semantic, that is, making it easily understandable by machines.
Yeah.
About 5 years ago, it became very important to do something about climate. Geeta was able to run an intern project, so she gets in 4 or 5 interns every 6 months in Delhi, and they work on semantic climate.
All right. It started when?
About 5 years ago.
How far is the project going, and what do you need, actually? That was one of the questions in the audience. What do you need from us?
What do we need? At the moment, it's a volunteer project, so we need volunteers.
Okay.
But we also need people to use and analyse and criticise what we create, because until we have that, we don't quite know whether it's the best way of doing things.
All right.
So we want users and we want contributors.
And in terms of contributors, what kind of skills are you looking for?
Almost anything. So coders, yes. People who can manage documents, yes. People who can give talks and publicise, people who can make films, people who can advocate and go out and spread the word, all these sorts of things.
All right, because it's about scraping documents, isn't it? It's about all these different reports that exist and putting them together.
So what it is that the United Nations creates a very valuable documents on climate, and these are literally tens of thousands of printed pages, but they're only accessible generally if you can read English and you've got enough will to read through it. So what we're doing is making it semantic and able to be understood by machines.
Right. This is the first time in FOSDEM, you told me.
It is indeed, yes.
Okay, so what brought you to FOSDEM then particularly?
Well, I was invited by Sarah Petty from the Open Knowledge Foundation, and she suggested I'd give a talk.
Yeah, indeed, and you were the very first one. You opened the whole thing.
Yes.
Indeed, exactly. How do you like it so far?
It's everything I imagined. It's also very noisy.
As we can hear. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, are you staying for the whole 2 days?
Absolutely, yes.
If that's a project that interests you and you want to volunteer, why don't you get in touch with Peter? The contact details are included in the show notes. Moving on to a different subject now, let me introduce you to Simon Tournier from GUIX, that is G-U-I-X, an open source package manager. French listeners might recognize Simon from an interview which my colleague Ghislain did with members from the GUIX team last year. Anyway, Simon made his way to Brussels to talk about an important subject, that of preserving software and software artifacts, and why it matters. With his GUIX hat on, he talked about how the project profits from one of the main software archivers we have today, that is Software Heritage. Software Heritage is an organization based in Paris, and they offer archiving your research software, but also any other software, for instance from private sector. And without bragging, I actually had the opportunity and pleasure to talk to Moran Green-Peter and Benoit Chauvet from Software Heritage a couple of years ago. But back to Simon. He gave a number of examples of what could go wrong with software if you don't look after it and if you don't archive it, and how that is a problem when you try to reproduce results, say for a research project or paper, years later. I got hold of Simon shortly after his talk to record a few words. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Peter.
We spoke before. Well, actually, we didn't speak before. It was Ghislain and you who spoke before, but I was in the recording. You work at Gigs, don't you?
Yeah. I'm working for the Gigs project, yeah.
And you give a presentation today here at FOSDEM about Gigs. But could you quickly introduce yourself and say a little bit about what Gigs is?
I'm a research engineer for the University of Paris-Cité. And I'm working with medical doctors and biologists to analyze biomedical data.
Okay, and Gigs is what?
Yeah, and Gigs is very helpful because Gigs help us to manage the computational environment and it helps us to have the reproducible computational environment, or at least to be able to audit and verify that what we put inside the computational environment.
Yeah, and I think one of the slides, that was a little bit scary because it showed that when you look at the current software, so 4% of the links are broken, actually, and the further you go back in time, the more link rot you get.
I think one of the big challenge for the public research, academic research, is about the link rot. So link rot is that the data we put on the internet disappear for whatever reason. Servers are down, people stop the services, for example, Google Code, Bitbucket, and so on. And what do we do once we publish a paper where inside we have one URL pointing for some content and so on, and this content disappear because the server is down or whatever? What do we do? And the solution is software heritage.
Indeed, exactly. And it's funny because I interviewed Software Heritage, I think, 2 years ago. So is Gigs then itself on Software Heritage?
So Gigs itself is on Software Heritage. So Software Heritage, what it is? Software Heritage is an archive for all the source code, publicly available source code. So they ingest all the publicly available source code and they try to archive that for on the long term. You can ask me why this will not fail as Google Code, Bitbucket, and so on.
And I'm asking you that now.
and the reason, I think, it's because it's 2 points. First one is non-profit, and it's supported by UNESCO and this kind of organization that try to preserve the common goods. And the second one is because it's international. So we have a lot of different sponsors from different countries and so on. So we can hope that it's built with a long term in mind.
I think they had a conference in Paris recently.
Yeah. 2 days ago, we were in a software heritage symposium at UNESCO
headquarter. So are you then working directly with software heritage, or is it simply that Gigs is using software heritage?
Gigs is just a user of software heritage API.
And software heritage is not just for France, is it?
Software Heritage is it's an international project hosted in France.
Staying with the theme of archiving for just a little bit longer, let me turn to another speaker, also from Paris, Guillaume Lévrier. Guillaume works at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, François Mitterrand in Paris, surely the right place when it comes to archiving and preserving things. But his focus was on something else. The BNF keeps a vast archive of web pages and sites, but some of the data are not public or are covered by restrictive licenses. So if you're a researcher studying a topic that needs to access these data in some form, you have a problem. To help with that, Guillaume has been developing an open source solution called Coordonnées, which he talked about at FOSDEM. Over to Guillaume now. You're from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France.
I'm a political scientist, currently an associate researcher at the BNF, right?
And it's about scraping data that are not open or where the copyright is not sure, but making it available through open
so
source.
it's Internet Archive, so it's the same concept. The BNF is obliged by law to harvest the French web, and they do that by crawling the web using different strategies. And so the problem we have now is that this harvesting has been going on for a quarter century, but the means to actually parse and analyze that data still lack a little bit. There are tools, but researchers usually do not have the capacity to use those tools because they are quite complex for researchers that are not specialists of either computer science or the specific activity or practice of parsing the web archives. So my purpose as a political scientist is to try to build a tool that is much easier to use for people like me, political scientists, sociologists, ethnographers, that want to try and have a bit more depth on their digital fieldworks.
Right, okay. And you described a one-way mirror kind of approach, because
Absolutely.
the problem is that the data sometimes are closed.
So the data is closed to the extent that whatever is being harvested by the BNF, in theory, by law, can only be harvested by the BNF because it's protected by the rights of the authors.
Okay.
So everything is under rights, and the only people that can access it in theory are the archivists themselves and researchers that show that they need to work on those archives. So you cannot take anything out of this archive, and you have to go on site, use specific computers in a specific network to be able to have a look at this data. But the sheer scale of the archive makes that very difficult. You don't know where to start. So there's a process that is an ongoing process of indexing those archives in order to enable us researchers to just input a string of characters and try to have results. It's hard work. It requires a lot of material, capital, and labor from the BNF, so it's still ongoing. But now that there is the beginning of that movement, we can now have tools that can request this data while on site. So that lets you work on closed data. The thing is, in research, we like open data and we like open software. So that's this open mirror, one-way mirror, metaphor that we built is a reflection in a way of the compromise that we made in order to be able to do research in that captive context. The idea is that as a researcher, you can interrogate the data as if it was a suspect in a police office, which means that you cannot take the suspect out of that room, right? You cannot take it home with you. You can ask it questions. It can tell you a version of reality that it has in its memory, but there's a limit to what you can do with it. You can then go home, work on your narrative, you can work on your research, but anytime you want to have more information, empirical information on that specific data, you have to go back to the interrogation room. And another feature that I didn't mention during the presentation is that the archive itself doesn't know about you. That's also part of the one-way mirror paradigm, is that right now, in the way that we built the system, the archive itself doesn't know that it's queried because there is no write or delete access. There is just an API, there's an interface that manages the communication. So we found that paradigm of the one-way mirror, a way to describe this uneasy situation that we're constantly renegotiating to be able to provide open access to closed data that helps research but also protects the rights of the people that have been writing on the internet for the past quarter century.
So how long has this project been running then?
So it's an interesting question because the software in itself, Pandoray, is something I started building for my PhD, which I started in 2018. So it's quite old. It's maybe 7 or 8 years old.
Well, in the world of software. So.
Yeah, I mean, in that specific world, it's not that old. But it was first calibrated to query different types of documents. So Pandoray exclusively works on data that can be abstracted as documents. And I started by building it to query databases of scientific articles, like Scopus, Web of Science, those types of databases. And then when I needed to enlarge my fieldwork towards the internet, I was very frustrated to find that a lot of the activist discourse that I was looking for had disappeared from the web. So I had URLs, I had links, but I could not access the content. And that's how, through the Sciences Po Media Lab team, I have been put in touch with the BNF, and I started adapting Pandoray to be able to query the web archives available there.
There was also one session that interested me in particular as a podcaster, and it was from the Journal of Open Source Software, or JOS for short. JOS is pretty well known in the open source software community, and some of you listeners may have published there before. And they also have a podcast called, well, JOScast. Abigail, one of the podcast leads, talked to us about the many problems podcasters face of getting content out of the door and getting it funded. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to talk to her afterwards, but I do sympathize with many of the points she mentioned and the fact that people underrate the effort it takes to produce and publish podcasts. So from climate change over saving software and data access to talking about open source software in podcasts, well, this is just a glimpse of all the different topics covered in the Open Research Dev Room. And at that stage, we haven't even reached lunchtime yet. As I said before, this show never stops at FOSDEM, and there's no such thing as a lunch break, but you've got to eat at some stage, don't you? So I nipped out to grab a sandwich and a coffee for a bit and get ready for round 2 in the afternoon. Well, I needed that break. I don't know about you, but after sitting through a number of presentations, my brain starts to explode. Conferences, after all, are a little bit like an endurance sport, and FOSDEM is certainly no exception. Well, moving on, the afternoon session had more goodies in store, and there were some that listeners to this podcast have heard from before, like Dan Katz, for instance, who featured only in the episode from 2 weeks ago about a Python project called Parcel. Dan is also very active in the research software engineering community and a leading member of the US RSE Association. Another one is my friend Teresa Gomez-Diaz from the University Paris Gustave Eiffel. Last year, I talked to Teresa about her work on software management plans and the workshop she ran in Paris. At FOSDEM, she talked to us about an equally important subject, about the difficulties with sharing research data and research software. In fact, I did interview Teresa briefly about her talk for this podcast, but sadly, I completely messed up the recording. So sorry, Teresa, but if you want to find out more, Teresa and I talked about this in detail a while ago, and I include the link in the episode notes. I was also pleased to see Malvika Sharwan from the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, who actually finished the Dev Room in her last talk with an impassioned speech on how we can apply do no harm principles in our daily work, and why it matters that we do. Sandwiched between all of that were other very interesting talks. 2 in particular caught my eye. One was from Miguel from the University College London, where I worked previously. And he gave a number of examples of how open source software can, and should shape the future of healthcare. Which sounds all very well, but there are a number of obstacles to climb over before you can deploy open source software in clinical environments. For instance, there are strict regulations around apps and devices for healthcare, and for good reasons, as we need to make sure the software and medical devices help patients and not harm them. So let's hear a few words from Miguel now.
My name is Miguel Xochicale. I'm Senior Research Software Engineer at the Advanced Research Computer Center at UCL.
Indeed, and we were almost colleagues because I think you joined just after I left UCL.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
right.
And you gave a very interesting talk on healthcare and open source software, and it was absolutely amazing how much is happening in this space. Could you maybe highlight one of the open source projects that you're using?
Yes, indeed. So the talk I gave at FOSDEM is about how we make use of open software technologies that are kind of pushing the boundaries of healthcare and how this creating like the future of healthcare. We touch on the regulations and innovations challenges. And we mentioned few like use cases, for example, ultrasound synthetic imaging and real-time AI workflows, where we trying to accelerate the diagnosis from people who has eye diseases in the emergency settings department.
But I remember that it's quite difficult to actually get from the stage of using it in the lab, so to speak, to in a clinical environment, because what you've quite nicely shown is there is a maze of different regulations So how did you navigate that? You obviously need some help then, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, when you are trying to create like software as medical devices, you need to build a team of, I guess, specialists from engineering background, software, from quality management system as well, from clinical background. So that requires, I guess, a multidisciplinary effort. And then you sort of navigate this kind of translation, clinical translation with your team. And it's long journey because you start with a sort of simple prototype. You start kind of validating with like maybe sample data sets, maybe with, depends also on the project you work. For example, if you work with tissue with humans, then you potentially may need like animal experiments. So that maybe 1-2 years to do the experiments with animals, and then you go into the next phase, hold your kind of regulation pass, and then you start doing early experiments with humans. So it's a long journey, like we'll say some could take 5 to 10 years. Yeah, and the project I show today is very basic research, how you start kind of thinking about this translation.
Well, what you're saying is that from the basic research where you start sort of with a prototype to the actual use in clinic, that can take 5 to 10 years before it's actually accepted by the clinicians.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
in hospital environment.
Yeah, exactly. Because the stages of putting your QMS system where you need to mitigate any risk of what you're trying to develop, and that sometimes is not straightforward because I was saying you need the QMS expert telling you we need to fill maybe 10 forms or any number of forms that need to be aligned with your software development, and then this software needs to decide you have like a version control of this model you are working on. You have like a risk mitigation, and how this is related to certain standards may take a few years to go into that kind of stage that tick all the boxes to apply for regulations. Yeah.
The other interesting subject, I don't want to hold it for too long because we're outside and it's quite cold, is about data acquisition, because you mentioned some of the, I think it was the echo or the ultrasound examinations where you mentioned that sometimes for AI applications, in order to train data, the more data you can get is the better, but sometimes you simply do not have that. Could you quickly say something about that challenge that you faced?
Yeah, that's definitely another big challenge on how, I guess, researchers and anyone interested to use data from patients is facing. It's understandable because you don't want the data patient to be leaked, and you don't want to leak any kind of private information from patients. But at the same time, you are trying to help to develop certain disease, then you may struggle to find this kind of data sets. So, for example, in the case of fetal ultrasound imaging, you are looking for any development of the brain, then you may have access to these data sets. You have partnership with these institutions, but you, outside of this collaboration, you may struggle to find the right data sets. And that's where we think using open source datasets. Like there are a few cases we mentioned in the presentation, like the datasets from Spain and from Africa that can sort of helping researchers to improve this kind of acceleration of identifying any diseases for the development of baby brains.
As a scientist or researcher, you're constantly faced with the question of how to present your data and your results in a meaningful, understandable, but also impactful way. And when I say this, you may think of plots, pie charts, curves, and bars. Well, can we also use our bodies and body movements? This was the subject of Joanna's talk titled Human-Computer Counter Choreographies, where she talked about live coding sessions and how to use body movements or activities to help us experience data and code in a more direct and literally physical way, a work she's been doing at the University of the Arts in London. I was very intrigued, I confess, and I wanted to talk to Joanna about this briefly, so here she is.
My name is Joanna Chicao. I am a designer, I am a dancer, researcher, and I also do some coding. I'm not an engineer, software engineer, but I have a technical practice as well.
Right, and you gave a very fascinating talk today about choreography and data tracking, data analysis and computing in general. And that really got my head spinning, how all that fits together. So I hand over to you now.
So the research that I'm doing now combines choreography with data tracking algorithms. And the purpose is really actually to make these data tracking algorithms more visible, more audible, actually, essentially more tangible to people, to grow understanding, awareness of it, and hopefully to also provide clues for people to protect their data if they wish to.
I think one of the phrases that I saw on your slide was that looking over someone's shoulder to read the news is a little bit like Google, Facebook. How did you come up with that?
Actually, that quote belongs to Tactical Tech, which is an organization based in Berlin, and they have a lot of resources around not just data tracking, but like a lot of issues that happen in the internet and how to help people or provide tools for people to and resources to prevent those things. And I quite like these analogies. You know, I think there's so much we know from our lived experience outside of the screen that it's hard to bridge that with when we're using devices and online. And I sort of try to do the same. And when I bring choreography to the equation, is really to remind ourselves that we have bodies and that there's so much we can identify if we bring that awareness in.
Do you have any ideas how you can bring this awareness with body movements and computing?
Yes, in a lot of the workshops that I do, I also do performances, and I oftentimes provoke situations in which people have to move with their bodies, and I make connections between that movement and data tracking.
Right.
So I guess what we experience in the room, one example, is that I've asked people to stand up if they were part of a particular age group, and that's the same age group that, for example, Google Analytics uses as part of their software. So essentially, I just invite people to do certain things in order to understand what it means if we were being watched by algorithms, which we are, right? Or if if data was being collected. And when you do that, I think it becomes more tangible, because otherwise it's very abstract to think about these processes. And I do the same in my teaching at the university, and in general I think it's a tactic that I think it's very impactful, and it's also something that we all carry bodies and we all carry knowledge that comes along with having bodies. So I think that's just our ultimate technology.
It is our technology. And you do performances, you mentioned. I think you showed one of the performance which was on stage and some kind of track. Could you explain a little bit what that was about?
So I do live coding performances, and it's possible that people listening have already experienced a live coding performance. Usually there's people on stage, they are writing on their laptops, not necessarily all the time, but they are writing algorithms or manipulating algorithms in real time, and usually there's a projection that shows that to an audience. And I do the same with the intention of exposing data tracking algorithms. And for that, I'm using a DuckDuckGo browser extension, and I've altered it so that I'm sonifying and making visible the tracking requests. So it's a way to sort of make it, again, more sensible how this tracking works. By giving a rhythm to it, people also understand how prevalent they are, for example. And then I also combine with my own scripts that explain other aspects of tracking, for example, fingerprinting. So there's like a complementary, there's the tool aspect of it, the browser extension, but there's also my own JavaScript code that I combine into a narrative that helps people with the intention of supporting them in raising awareness of data tracking.
So is this your first time at FOSDEM then?
It is, yeah. I was very curious because I've been in similar events and I am part of communities that are, very eager to produce open source software, to maintain it. Actually, the live coding community is very strong on that principle. A lot of the tools we build, we share with each other, we maintain them together, and it's quite exciting. Yeah, I'm very curious to also continue exploring other lectures here.
Well, it's time for a wrap-up now. It was a pretty eventful but equally exhausting day at FOSDEM. I remember Theresa and I stumbling back into central Brussels for a relaxing meal and a couple of glasses of wine. FOSDEM is not for the faint-hearted. It's pretty dense and busy, so I take my hat off to the people who brave a second day. The Open Research Dev Room showed once more the breadth and depth of open source software and the essential role it plays in research. Something that I think has begun to sink in. Open science and with it open source software and open data are being written into many policies in universities and research centers. And increasingly, funders are requiring research projects to adopt open science principles. Some countries, like France for instance, even mandate that publicly funded research makes any software associated with it available as open source. But the work to promote open source software in research must continue all the same. As for the Open Research Dev Room, this was only part 1, or let me rephrase this. This was the official Dev Room at FOSDEM, because the organizers offered an unofficial and online-only Dev Room day a bit later in February, for all those who couldn't make it to Brussels or simply wanted more. I couldn't make it that day, so unfortunately I cannot give you an overview of that event. I guess it's a safe bet to say that open research will be at FOSDEM in 2026 again, in one form or another, so look out for the announcements for next year. If you want to go through the presentations from this year's Dev Room at FOSDEM, you can look at the slides or videos directly at the webpage for the Dev Room. You'll find the link along with all the others in the show notes. Next week, the last Tuesday in June, will be a German language episode where I will be talking to researchers at the Max Planck Institute in Munich, the section on psychology to be precise. So if you're a German language speaker or you want to brush up your language skills, I hope you'll tune in then. And just a final note, one of the listeners, Maxence from Karlsruhe in Germany, asked me to share a link to a survey. The aim of the survey is to find out what's keeping research software engineers and researchers who code up at night. That is, what are the challenges you're facing or think you will face in future? If you'd like to help Maxence with that, you'll find the link to the survey in the show notes. At the time of publishing this episode, the survey should still be open. And another short announcement, UCL, the University College London in the UK, will be running a workshop called Transforming Your Research Code into Professional Software between the 23rd and 27th of July, and at the time of recording there were still places left, so I included the booking link in the show notes as well. I should point out, however, that this is an in-person event only. So that's it for today. Until next time. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.